Whenever discussing the power of the Jujutsu Kaisen universe relative to other anime and manga, Gojo and his seemingly limitless array of hacks and abilities is always the most difficult thing to account for. Because of how absolute his control over space-time is, defeating him requires either ridiculous amounts of power or abilities that are just as broken and absolute as his. And in this video, I'll be talking about one character, one patriotic hero from the My Hero Academia universe who just might be able to get the job done. Star and Stripe, a character within My Hero who hasn't shown up to us in the anime quite yet, but one whose quirk in the manga may be powerful enough to defeat even Jujutsu Kaisen's strongest. Stars and Stripes is one of the most powerful and broken characters in the My Hero Academia universe. Because of her quirk New Order, Star is someone that even All For One considered a threat on par with that of One For All users like All Might and Deku, two of the strongest characters in the entire series. But more so than these two, Star is suited to go up against a character like Gojo because of her quirk New Order and the absolute dominion it gives her over reality. New Order is one of the most dominant and powerful quirks in My Hero Academia, and it is exclusively because of the overwhelming power that this quirk grants her that Star was able to become the most powerful woman in America and a hero that even the Demon Lord of the verse was wary of. New Order allows Star to assign a rule onto her existing surroundings by simply touching a given object and calling out its name. In battle, she typically uses this ability to amp her own stats to ridiculously high degrees, as with this quirk she can simply make contact with herself and declare that she wants monstrous levels of strength. Limitations to this quirk do exist for Star though, because she isn't able to reach All Might's level of power, nor is she able to give herself complete invulnerability to every form of attack. We see in the manga that something like Shigaraki's Decay can reach and even surpass the limit of the durability that New Order can grant her. However, Star's abilities demonstrate themselves much more impressively when you look at how she applies them to concepts that aren't her. Whether it be air, lasers, or even another human being, if she is able to touch you and call out your name, you will fall under her quirk's dominion. With this ability, we see that she is able to make an air construct that is over 1,000 times larger than her by simply making contact with the surrounding air and willing it to be true. With New Order, she is able to remove the surrounding air within 100 meters of her simply by touching the air and commanding it. This is an absolutely brutal usage of her quirk, one that was even somewhat efficient on the likes of Shigaraki, who has an extremely high regenerative rate. New Order has also allowed Star to grasp typically intangible or unholdable constructs, as she literally holds a laser via the application of her quirk. This means that Star would likely be able to apply her usage of New Order to concepts like red, blue, and potentially even purple if she so chose, due to the nature of her being able to grasp ungraspable things. Now, New Order is strong, dangerously so, but as demonstrated in her fight with Shigaraki, it isn't without its own drawbacks and restrictions. As I mentioned earlier, when applying one of her New Order rules to herself, Star isn't able to conjure up infinite strength, speed, or durability. The limits of her power are restricted to below that of All Might, which isn't anything to sneeze at, especially within the confines of the verse, but also just shows that this quirk isn't omnipotent. We also know that she can't just make a rule that kills everyone that touches air within a certain range, because if she could, she would have done so when trying to kill Shigaraki in her fight. But not only does she not opt to do this, likely due to a limitation of her quirk, but Shigaraki himself also surmises that Star has limitations when it comes to affecting people through roundabout contact. Star can only lethally attack people she isn't in direct contact with through roundabout means such as removing the air and hoping that it inhibits them. These two limitations by themselves would still present a massive problem for any character, including Gojo, but the hindrance that grounds her ability the most is the number of rules that New Order can have operating simultaneously. Stars and Stripes can only have two absolute demands in effect at one time, and in practice, it typically only results in one, as she almost always uses one of her rules to amp her physical stats, and against an opponent as powerful as Gojo, this will likely remain the case if she does not want to be immediately blitzed and bombarded with attacks she cannot survive. Still, even with the limitations that this quirk has, the ability of New Order should not be underestimated, as if she is able to make contact with an opponent and utters their name with one command, she can stop a person's heart. Now, covering Star's quirk before I got into scaling her physical abilities is a bit different from what I usually do in battles like these, but that's simply because more than anything else, New Order is going to be the trump card that could possibly allow her to get past the limitless, but her physical feats are still very relevant to the outcome of this battle as they determine whether or not she'd even be able to use her quirk in the first place. Now, when it comes to scaling Star's strength, durability, and speed relative to the rest of the My Hero Academia universe, things get a little dicey because of a few statements regarding her abilities that I mentioned earlier. The main limitation of her strength scaling comes from a statement in which he says that she is unable to conjure power on par with All Might, immediately excluding her from access to all of the feats and statements he has power-wise within the series. Now, this in and of itself presents some interesting problems because when she makes this statement, she isn't clear as to whether or not she's referring to a weakened All Might or All Might in his prime. If Star is referring to Prime All Might here, this does leave the potential for her to scale to or even above weakened versions of the character that we have seen throughout a majority of the series. When weakened, All Might has multiple showings in the story that would place him at least at mountain levels of attack potency, which in the best case scenario for Star would mean that she can also potentially scale to this level of strength. This idea would also be somewhat backed up by the fact that she's able to do minimal damage to Shigaraki with her punches, but not nearly enough to endanger his life nor overpower his hyper regeneration. If you are less charitable to Star though, and assume that her statement refers to the weakened All Might that we see in the series, this would actually mean that she is confirmed weaker than mountain level in terms of attack potency. One may argue that it would be foolish to say that Star scales below that of a weakened All Might because of how powerful she is and the fact that she herself doesn't make that caveat, but we actually have some narrative implications in backing that would lend to the idea that she's incomparable to weakened All Might as well as him in his prime. This implication comes from Shigaraki's own statements on how powerful he is relative to Japan's #1 hero. In the first war arc, Shigaraki is stated rather plainly to be as physically powerful as All Might even when in his incomplete state. This Shigaraki then goes on to face Stars and Stripes while still being an incomplete character and has the ability to overpower her physically, only really being handled when the combined efforts of Star and her friends grant her extra attacking options. On top of this, she relies on a literal barrage of missiles to finish the job against him, as it's clear that her own strength would not be sufficient in dealing with Shigaraki. This fact is important because after he finally becomes a complete vessel, we get another statement from him that compares him to that strength of All Might, only this time he makes the distinction that he is like All Might in his prime. To me, this shows two things. The first is that whenever Horikoshi wants to make it clear that a character is as powerful as Prime All Might, that distinction will be made clear in the text. All Might, when referred to generally as a power comparison, is likely referring to his early weakened showings in the series. The second thing this shows me is that Shigaraki's completion resulted in him making that jump in power from weakened All Might to All Might in his prime, a very considerable difference in strength, durability, and speed. Considering the fact that Star wasn't even able to put down an incomplete Shigaraki with her fist alone, it's pretty safe to say that she isn't quite as strong as All Might even after his career-shortening injury. In spite of all that, she is still able to do some level of damage to Shigaraki, and that would require some level of relativity to even nerfed versions of All Might. But just note that Star, even with this hard fact, caps out at mountain level. Now, in comparison to her AP, Star's speed is significantly easier to scale. You see, in her battle with Shigaraki, we see that she's able to react to and catch lasers with her bare hands. Not only is she able to do this, but she's actually fast enough to touch the lasers with her physical body and immediately activate New Order to make the lasers holdable. Similarly, Shigaraki is able to reflect and even grasp the lasers through a myriad of his own quirks, and Star is able to react to the movements of Shigaraki in spite of him being the slightly faster character. Assuming that these lasers are in fact light-based because of the properties shown off in the battle, this would mean that Star is capable of reacting and moving at relativistic speeds. In the context of My Hero Academia and light speed scaling though, I know that many people get really skeptical and extremely critical of feats of this magnitude. One of the arguments against the relativistic speed scaling for Star states that she simply placed her arms in front of her before the lasers hit, or was actually hit by the lasers and then grabbed them reactively, and Shigaraki would have done the same before activating his quirks. Due to the nature of manga as a medium, it is somewhat hard to confirm or deny if Star and Shigaraki actually reacted to the beams in the first place, and as such, I think this skepticism does hold some level of credence to it. If you are someone that thinks this feat is invalid or simply too ambiguous to scale properly, the next best line of scaling you have available comes from a calc estimating the speed required to catch up to Lady Nagant's bullet. When all of the measurements are taken into into account, this feat comes out to being around 327 times the speed of sound. When Deku accomplishes this, he says that through the combination of one-for-all quirks like Black Whip, Fajin, and his normal 45% boost, he's able to replicate All Might's speed at 100% without any of the recoil. With this statement, we once again run into a little bit of an interpretation problem. Is he referring to Prime All Might or the weakened version is the question that we have to answer. In the event that this feat is similar to that of All Might in his prime, Star likely doesn't scale that closely to it due to her inability to replicate All Might's physical feats. This would mean that she would be downgraded well below this speed down to just being high hypersonic plus as opposed to massively hypersonic. But if this feat refers to a weakened All Might, Star could be in the same ballpark of speed as this feat due to her ability to react to the attacks of an incomplete Shigaraki, someone who was on the level of a weakened All Might. Being charitable to Star in this situation, the effective lowball for her speed would be around 300 times the speed of sound. Just like I always do in versus battles like this, I'll factor in both the high and lowballed stats when determining who would win this battle. With that being said, it's about time we take a look at Gojo to see how he measures up. As the current strongest character in Jujutsu Kaisen, scaling Gojo's physical abilities is rather easy because he upscales every feat demonstrated in the series up to this point. In terms of AP, Gojo should scale above the likes of the Disaster Curse Spirits pretty easily. Jogo alone has shown the ability to create impacts on a city block scale, and when going all out, he can construct a domain that houses an entire mountain inside of it. Not only is Gojo above Jogo in every capacity, but we've actually seen a direct comparison of domains, and Gojo was able to utterly dominate the volcano-based curse. In fact, we even see Gojo take the brunt of one of his domain amplified attacks with a casual block of his arm. Scaling above Jogo is pretty important because this also means that he far exceeds Dagon, someone who can construct an entire island within the confines of his domain. I've explained this before on the channel, but many people have the misconception that the inside of a domain expansion is similar in size and dimensions to the outside of the domain, making all of the creation feats null and void, but this couldn't be further from the truth. It is very blatantly stated that the dimensions both inside and outside of the domain are different on numerous occasions, meaning that it is possible for Dagon's domain to house a structure the size of a literal island on the inside, while on the outside barely creating a large enough barrier to contain 5 people. Due to the power system and the way space is distorted when domains are created, this sort of paradox is possible. And because domain expansions are simply created by one's own cursed energy and cursed technique, they should indeed scale to their user. In short, Dagon can create an island, Jogo has power that exceeds Dagon's, and Gojo outscales both of them, meaning that he is island level at the bare minimum. When only using material that isn't a blatant spoiler for manga fans, this is about as high as Gojo's strength feats can go. However, peering into the manga for a bit of information and scaling shows that he might have a whole nother level of strength that was previously thought impossible for him and the rest of the Jujutsu Kaisen verse. Chapter 208 of the manga is what gives him this possibility. In this chapter, we see that Yuki Tsukumo was able to create a black hole powerful enough to destroy the planet if left unrestricted. And on top of this, with the combined efforts of her and Tengen, they are able to suppress and limit the range of destruction that this potential world-ending black hole has, solidifying the idea that JJK characters can potentially have planet-busting power, even if only in hyper-specific contexts. This world-altering power is backed up by a volume cover statement in which it said that full-power Sukuna could destroy the world as we know it. Now, I don't want to get into Sukuna versus Gojo within the confines of this video, but I think regardless of who you think would win, it's fair to say that these sorcerers should at least be relative to one another, and it gives more credence to the idea of planet levels of AP being possible for the god tier JJK characters. Obviously, Gojo would scale to this Yuki feat due to the numerous statements and feats that place him above her and every other character in the story, but if you are someone that is skeptical of this type of scaling due to the relatively grounded nature of Jujutsu Kaisen fights, I can't blame you. I'll address both the island level and planetary scaling later in this video when discussing the matchup to hopefully appease both sides of the aisle. Now, just like with his strength, Gojo's speed is above that of everyone in the verses, with a narrator statement doubly confirming that for us. For his low-end scaling, you have him being vaguely above the likes of Naoya's Mach 3 speed. If you take that at face value and think it's consistent with the rest of the narrative, then Gojo would just be above this level of speed because Maki and Toji are faster than Naoya, and Gojo has shown himself to be faster than Toji and Maki. I personally think this is contradicted by numerous other feats in the narrative, including consistent reaction to gunfire and other attacks that move at speeds faster than sound, dodging them in such a way that even something like Yuji's avoidance of Choso's piercing blood should require speeds above that of Mach 3. But as of chapter 212, the big speed feat for Jujutsu Kaisen is Hikari's reaction to lightning. Lightning is pretty consistently agreed to move around 300 times the speed of sound, and while Hikari isn't able to completely avoid this attack in either instance it is launched at him, we do see that he is able to visually register and subsequently dodge or react to the attack based on its initial coordinates. Because of the distance that Hikari would have to cross to not be hit in the face relative to the distance that the lightning moved within the same time frame, it's possible that he moved well beyond lightning speed, with some calcs arguing for Mach 800. Gojo, once again, for obvious reasons, upscales from this feat, and as a result would vaguely exist in the range of 300 to 800 times the speed of sound. Outside of disingenuous arguments and ridiculous highballs, Gojo's level of speed doesn't get much higher than that, only leaving his hacks and technique to discuss. And if you're a fan of Jujutsu Kaisen or a fan of the channel, at this point you have to know how this song and dance goes. Gojo has access to the limitless, a technique that gives him access to 4 different abilities. The first and most notorious is infinity. There are a lot of mathematical and scientific descriptions that could be given to explain the ins and outs of this technique, but all you need to know for the sake of this video is that with infinity, Gojo is untouchable by normal means. Blue allows for Gojo to teleport himself and others, move extremely quickly outside of the context of teleportation, create giant rifts in space-time that can attract his opponents towards any given target, and even spawn his technique onto a person's body in order to mangle and damage their limbs. Red is the reversal of this ability, and it is just a big blast of energy that is double the cursed energy output of blue. No real crazy hacks or anything with this particular utilization of the limitless, as it is essentially just a lot of cursed energy hitting you really hard. We do know that Gojo can delay the explosion of red if he wants to catch an opponent off guard, with it having a pretty similar effect in practice to Yuji's Divergent Fist. Purple is the combination of red and blue, and this ability totally annihilates its target. Even if you can survive both blue and red respectively, purple is strong enough to run you through in most cases. Outside of his domain, this is Gojo's most powerful technique. On top of having the limitless, Gojo also possesses the Six Eyes, which gives him a large amount of cursed energy control and a heightened sense of perception and awareness. Because of these very eyes, Gojo is able to automate the limitless and have it work passively, constantly regenerating his body and essentially allowing him to never run out of stamina. This leaves Gojo's trump card, his domain expansion, Infinite Void. This domain traps his opponents within a space and immediately floods them with so much information that the person in question cannot move or activate any abilities. And unlike other characters in the verse, Gojo apparently has the ability to open his domain expansion multiple times in one day, with the number of confirmed openings going all the way up to 5. Needless to say, if his domain lands, the fight is essentially over. With all of that being said, and both characters being scaled, it's about time to put these two powerhouses against one another. Will Star and her new order Quirk be enough to take Gojo down, or will Gojo's overwhelming amount of hacks simply be too much for the strongest woman in America? Now, when it comes to the outcome of this battle, things get a little complicated for a myriad of reasons. Both of these characters' hacks can be used and spammed in so many different ways that you could probably write a whole book on how this fight could play out depending on the circumstances. The most straightforward part of their dynamic comes from a statistical comparison. When lowballing both characters to the max, Star is significantly faster than Gojo, likely being tens of times faster than he is, with Gojo being significantly stronger than Star, with the difference between mountain level and island level AP being hundreds of times. In the event that you highball both of them, Gojo is still stronger, but significantly slower than Star once more, because her max speed and strength would be relativistic and mountain level respectively, while Gojo's max speed and strength would be Mach 800 and planetary. Because the dynamic between the two stats don't really change regardless of whether you lowball or highball them, this fight comes down to strategy, character, in hacks. The reason I say the method of scaling both characters physically is irrelevant is simply because no matter how you slice it, Star will be faster than Gojo to the point of there being no relativity, and Gojo will be stronger than Star to basically the same degree. Character will factor quite heavily into how this fight goes, mainly because Star's ability to use New Order on the Limitless heavily depends on how arrogant and chatty Gojo decides to be in this fight. In his scuffle with Jogo, for example, he is willing to divulge both the name of his technique and even shows it off to him in a very overt way, not taking him seriously in the slightest, with the reason being that Jogo could never hope to harm him, even if he did know the ins and outs of the limitless curse technique. Some may think that this automatically locks Gojo into being an arrogant guy who can never keep his mouth shut. However, Gojo has shown himself to be very boisterous and confident time and time again, but it's not like this is the only way he approaches a fight. In his battles against Sukuna in the beginning of the story, Toji in Hidden Inventory, and the Disaster Curse Spirits in Shibuya, we see that he is unwilling, or rather does not care, to share his abilities. Even when he has the obvious upper hand against Toji and Sukuna, he isn't blabbing about his abilities and simply gets the job done. And this rings true, especially in the rare cases that he is feeling pressure. Him revealing his technique and keeping his cards close to his chest are both possibilities, and in the event that he is more secretive about things, Star doesn't really have a hope in defeating him. New Order requires physical contact and the name of the thing being touched to actually work. So although in theory she could make contact with Infinity and impose a rule that allows her to bypass it, in practice this can only be done if Gojo divulges this information to her willingly. Despite this disadvantage, it's not like she can't attack Gojo from afar, as she would be able to just remove the oxygen in the surrounding area, immediately causing Gojo to asphyxiate. This would do some damage to him, sure, because Gojo still does need to breathe. However, one usage of blue would be able to get him out of Star's range, and RCT would be right on the scene, regenerating his body back to its previous state. While Star is way faster than Gojo, without the ability to grab hold of Infinity and use New Order to move past it, she wouldn't be able to kill Gojo, but he would be able to kill her, in many different ways in fact. For one, even with verse equalization, if we're being really ratty and just very straightforward, Star shouldn't be able to see any of Gojo's jujutsu if we're being real, because quirks aren't a byproduct of a power system like chakra, nen, or ki. It's the result of a physical adaptation completely unrelated to cursed energy. In reality, having no cursed energy would actually make her more akin to a heavenly restriction user than a jujutsu sorcerer, but because it gets into a whole can of worms and gives her access to abilities that she shouldn't really have, I do not want to open that door. So let's just say that Star can see cursed energy, and Gojo is feeling especially confident today. So much so that he's willing to go into his whole spiel about space and infinity and how he controls it oh so well. If this happens, Star almost immediately makes contact with Infinity and would employ a rule that allows her to bypass it. You would think that the fight immediately swings in her favor in the event that she can pull this off, but because she is so weak physically compared to Gojo, her actual punches, kicks, or any other bodily based attacks just would not be enough to put him down, especially when he can heal off any minute amounts of damage that she actually can deal out to him. Gojo, however, would still be able to spawn multiple blue points onto her body at any time in order to immediately crush her limbs, very similar to what he did to Korak Man, and if for some reason that doesn't work, he can always attract her into his range and use a domain expansion, which would immediately take her out of the fight, negate her speed advantage, and grant Gojo the victory. In fact, when looking at both of their characters and how they fight, it might not even come to that, as depending on what Star's reaction is to a ranged attack like red or purple, she might even try to grab the wave of energy like she did the laser in order to throw it back at him, but because of its overwhelming power, even if she was able to make it holdable, she'd immediately be torn apart from the force that it is generating. The only way that Star could actually kill Gojo is by circumventing the Limitless via New Order and using her superior speed to make contact with Gojo and stop his heart, just like she tried to do with Shigaraki. She really has all of the tools necessary to pull off the plan in a perfect scenario. She has the hacks and speed necessary to pull off a strategy like this. However, there are some pretty major hurdles that stop this from becoming a reality, at least one that happens very repeatedly. The first is that New Order only allows for 2 rules to be implemented at one time, meaning that she cannot bypass Infinity, amplify her stats, and stop Gojo's heart simultaneously. One of these things must give, and if she loses the ability to get around Infinity, she's back to square one. If she loses her physical stats, Gojo is going to absolutely annihilate her before she even gets to activate her new ability, because she'd be like a regular human. Even if this wasn't a factor somehow, stopping Gojo's heart as a method of killing him just wouldn't work based on what we've seen Reverse Curse Technique do. You may wonder why I say she stops his heart instead of like blowing up his head or doing something much more lethal, but it's in character for Star to go for this method of killing even when bloodlusted, so there's no reason she would do something different against Gojo. Now, stop stopping hearts isn't something that your average Jujutsu Kaisen character can just shrug off, but when you realize that high levels of RCT have healed, destroyed, or removed hearts, it becomes kinda absurd to think that just stopping one would be enough to kill a character as skilled with healing as Gojo. And at that range where she's close enough to actually touch him, all he has to do is say domain expansion to close out the fight and eliminate Star and Stripe's ability to even resist. Even with the odds completely stacked in her favor, Star is able to do nothing that permanently puts down Jujutsu Kaisen's strongest.